many of whom are physicians. Oh. And this is just one of our typical lactation consultation rooms. We have the chair that you see in the back right, which is an electronic chair that reclines so we can work with moms in side-lying position or laid back positions. So we really, and then we have enough room there so that the partner or grandparent can come into. We really try and bring in the entire family unit that wants to be there to help support mom. And as I said, at any point, 15 IBCLCs, some are straight up IBCLCs, but other ones are nurse or NP, PA, and physician IBCLCs. So just a recap of breastfeeding in the US, we had really good breastfeeding rates for, a couple 100,000 years, right? Really close to 100%, I always say. And then somebody got the notion of taking milk from another animal and putting it into a receptacle and putting that receptacle into babies' mouths, right? And interestingly, think about where we are culturally, where that became known as milk. Did your kid get a full glass of milk? Don't forget to drink milk with dinner, except that's cow breast milk. Why don't we call that cow breast milk? Because, or cow udder milk, whatever you want to call it. But you would think human milk would just be milk, but no, we call cow's milk milk, and like breast milk, if you think about it, human breast milk has this extra special category. So that really changed, started the cascade of how things changed, so that finally people realized you could ramp this up and scale it up at an industrial level, and you can make lots of cow-based milk formula, and you can feed that via lots of bottles to lots of babies, and thus was born the formula industry. And what once took a village to successfully breastfeed was now taking an industrial complex to feed millions and millions of kids. So this kind of tipped the scales into how we viewed feeding babies. And I know I'm not telling you guys anything new, but obviously we have data that showed that once big formula really ramped up as an industry, we had breastfeeding initiation rates. And this is data captured by the formula companies, that in 1971, only 21% of women even attempt to breastfeed. That's 1 in 5 attempts. Obviously, a good number of them weren't able to succeed. So that's pretty dramatic if you think about it. And the really sophisticated thing here is that, and again, I told you I do a lot of the business side of healthcare. This was a pretty diabolically, amazingly effective plan, which is if you can knock out the artistry and the handing over of breastfeeding skills from grandmother to mother to daughter, right, or to granddaughter, that really destroys what hundreds of thousands of years was the norm, where aunts and grandmothers and mothers would just help the next generation to breastfeed, which is why you had some dude like me with an IBCLC helping people to breastfeed, because we had lost that societal helping of one another to breastfeed. So diabolical, but super effective. And thus, we see like the US formula market, and this was actually back like a decade ago, was a $4 billion market. And let's be very clear, every failed breastfeeder is a formula customer. So there was real data that started coming out showing, wow, these formula reps, and again, I was friends with formula reps, very nice people. I mean, they're absolutely chosen because they're very nice people, but recognize their provision of free formula to doctors' offices and to hospitals was strategic in a business sense. They knew that providing formula and introducing formula early on eroded breastfeeding success. Absolutely. So just having free formula available, giving free formula away, and still moms, when they register with their OB-GYNs and peds, are getting formula coupons still delivered to them because they know it is really effective at reducing breastfeeding success, and then making a 9 or 12 or 15-month or 18-month customer to buy their product, right? I'm not here to bash formula companies, right? Formula can be very vital to families, not just specialty formulas, but families that choose not to breastfeed, but recognize, let's not manufacture breastfeeding failures, which is part of the business plan. I mean, they may deny it, but the data is clear. So, the infant feeding business is kind of a mix of madmen and big corporate headquarters and lots of money and very well dressed, very nice representatives. And you'd say, well, who's this person? And I say, well, this is a healthcare professional that was kind of co-opted into the whole marketing of formula. And I remember, again, as a resident, early on, we saw our formula rep weekly or every other week with lots of nice giveaways and lots of free formula. As a matter of fact, they stocked the shelves back then. I don't know if you remember when formula reps were given free rein to go and stock the shelves in the hospital, never really letting the hospital know how much of value was being given, because when eventually, like especially toward 10 steps where you're not allowed to be getting free formula, they'd say, oh, we have to buy formula. And they ask the rep, and they're like, oh, you're being given, you need to buy $1 million worth of formula to make up for that. And then hospital CFOs would be like, oh my God, well, let's keep getting the free stuff. So recognize that not only were hospital administrators, but docs and nurses were co-opted into this, just as they were in these types of ads, co-opted into selling cigarettes. You might say, oh my God, that just doesn't seem even real, but it was. These are real campaign ads. And, we clearly weren't being part of the solution. So it isn't so different when you see healthcare professionals, docs and nurses pushing formula as well. So this is just more historic ads where you see healthcare professionals pushing formula. So again, not here to bash formula. Formula, as I said, may be necessary for families who can't breastfeed or where kids need a specialized formula. So I recognize it can be life-saving, but it's very, very convenient. And it's that convenience and its ability to erode breastfeeding success that is truly problematic. So we know that supplemental feedings can decrease breastfeeding effectiveness through all of these types of reasons. And we know that breastfeeding human milk or provision of human milk, even if it's not directly from the breast, is not equivalent to cow's milk. And that is something that I would tell you that there was data less than a decade ago showing that a lot of the lay public didn't understand that. And even worse yet, a lot of healthcare professionals felt, they're pretty equivalent. You can thrive on one or you can thrive on the other. True. I was not breastfed. You can grow up and be an adult. You can probably be president and not be breastfed. But let's be clear, we aren't helping when we promote formula as an equivalent option to breast milk, because it isn't. Formula doesn't have these things. Some of these things can't be created outside of the human body. And these are just some of the things that we know that are in breast milk, with more and more being discovered, right? This is what you call dose-dependent effects, meaning the more you get, the more breastfeeding you do, or the more breast milk you receive, the better the impact of these reductions on cancer for moms, which could be breast or ovarian. For kids, it could be leukemias and lymphomas. And looking down that list, these are the kind of things that we spend billions of dollars fighting on the back end once you are found to be high risk or have already developed these issues. When on the front end, we know you could help prevent them. Does that mean that breastfeeding will absolutely eliminate the risk for cancer or will eliminate bone loss? No. Same thing for kids. Would absolutely eliminate those conditions? No, but it can have a significant impact. And when I say significant, necrotizing enterocolitis, babies that are highly premature in the NICU, I think the last study I saw was like a 75% reduction using human milk versus a formula. And SIDS rates are significantly reduced with breastfeeding versus formula feeding, as are a lot of the other things you see here. I was thrilled in my work to be able to meet with the Surgeon General. If you guys remember back in 2011, that was Dr. Benjamin. It was definitely fun to be able to meet with her. That was when we saw the call for action and more of normalization of support of breastfeeding, and a standard of care. That's also when the business case for breastfeeding was really being pushed out, letting businesses know that there was a return on investment for them to support their employees to breastfeed. We also know that the Affordable Care Act with Section 4207 started creating standards in the workplace about making sure that you had a private, lockable, non-bathroom for moms to be able to pump their breast. So now we are seeing incredibly encouraging, at least initiation rates. In the top there, we see that 83% of women initiate breastfeeding. That's a heck of a lot better than where we were when we were only 1 in 5. Now we're 4 in 5 of women self-characterize, excuse me, self-characterize as wanting to breastfeed. Now, the two main reasons that they don't meet their goals: one, lousy support. They don't get the support that they need. And if you think about the resources that we have, while they're improving, we don't get to every mom in the time that we should with the information that they need. And honestly, that should be prenatally to start with. The only group that I know that reaches moms prenatally from the first visit on are midwives. It's true. It is a model that we should all look toward. So giving moms that information early on, because I've had plenty of moms that have babies that are then still just deciding, I don't know, formula or breastfeeding. That's not an informed consent in trying to figure out how to decide what you're going to do for feeding your baby. And if they knew that the risk for diabetes and cancers and all those other things, not to mention SIDS and necrotizing enterocolitis, if they knew that those risks existed, would that impact their decision making? It probably would. Now, exclusive breastfeeding duration still drops off quickly, though way better than it was 5, 10, and 15 years ago. So one reason women don't meet their goals are not sufficient support. The other one is early return to work. Let's not forget that the US, as developed and prosperous as a country as it is an outlier in that we don't have paid maternity leave, right? That is a huge problem. When I have patients who have to return to work in a week or 2 weeks or 3, or sometimes they get the benefit of 2 months or 3 months, but unpaid oftentimes, and then having to return, even though they may want to breastfeed for a year, whereas in many other countries where their health care is better, their quality is measured to be much better, and their system of care is actually cheaper, and yet they can provide paid maternity leave and leave for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, even 12 months in developed Western countries. How can they do that and do so at a more effective cost with better quality? I think it's reasonable that we keep reevaluating how we're doing. And I would tell you straight up, our healthcare and our approach to breastfeeding are not great compared to other countries. I did look at recent survey data, and there substantiates again that we're up over 83% nationally of people that characterize of even attempting to breastfeed. And those numbers are still way better across the board than they were 5 and 10 years ago. I did look at the just the report card that's put out on breastfeeding rates. And again, in Oklahoma, you're looking at 78.8% plus or minus 5.7% of initiation rates, right? I think that's huge. Look where you guys were 5 and 10 years ago. Now, I remember when I gave a talk out of California and it was like 98%. I said, I made a joke, you could throw a stick and hit somebody that was breastfeeding at that moment. But still, these rates are really good. And when I look at Pennsylvania, we're right in that same kind of ballpark as you guys. We're improving year by year, which I think is phenomenal, considering when I started and became an IBCLC in 1995, how poor rates were still and how poor support was. So we're trending in a positive direction, but I think we need to continue to work together. And I love that your coalition does this work in the state of Oklahoma to continue to improve rates. So this was a slide I always like to doodle when I was drawing and saying that, at the worst time in the 70s, we had grassroots movements, including like Lamaze, to really get breastfeeding recognized and moving in the right direction. And then in the 80s to 90s, started having real breakdown of the benefits of breastfeeding, even at the molecular level, and that work continues. And then as we got into 2000s, looking at population health, which is really where we are now, how do we affect large swaths of the population? And we know that we can do that with something as awesome as breastfeeding. And then in 2010 and beyond, recognizing that there was a return on investment to improve breastfeeding, right? Like I told you, the business case for breastfeeding, which was pushed out by the Office for Women's Health, and I was trained on that. And Kathy Carruthers, I worked with her, and she was my trainer on the business case for breastfeeding, showed employers that if they could help their employees meet their breastfeeding goals, that they actually saw that it came back to the business in terms of a return on investment, meaning for every dollar spent, they enjoyed more than a dollar coming back in terms of reduced absenteeism, reduced presenteeism, which was being at work but not really being productive. So workplaces that were supportive of breastfeeding moms actually saw a real benefit. And the question is, heading into the 2020s now, there's more and more data to show the benefits for supporting breastfeeding at a national level and at a state level. So congrats to the work that you guys are doing. Now, sometimes I have to get into my business argument. So, especially when I would give presentations nationally for the American Academy of Pediatrics or large pediatric audiences. And I said, look, this isn't a trick question. If you make hats and you find out that 83% or 78% of your market likes blue hats, what color hat should you make? Blue, right? Not a trick question. If 83% of your moms, or if in Oklahoma, 78% of your moms are self-characterized as saying, I want to try and start breastfeeding, why aren't we trying to meet them there? And I would argue that pediatricians are big offenders of this in terms of why do we not have more resources in our offices? You know, we are trained. One of the jokes I always talk about for pediatricians, and I actually didn't put the slide into this talk, but if I said diaphoresis, headaches, palpitations, hypertension, you would jump out and say, oh my gosh, that sounds like a pheochromocytoma, which I would say you're right. And you're asked that question on all your boards, even though it's a rare neuroendocrine tumor that shows up like 2 to 8 per million people. But you're asked that on every board because like it has to be asked, but it doesn't really, does it? Because I'll probably never see one of those. I only saw 1 or 2 in residency. And if I miss the diagnosis, the symptoms are scary enough that I'll send it to the hospital where the specialist can make the diagnosis. But how the hell am I not trained to help support breastfeeding in a cogent way in my pediatric practice, where 3 out of 4 moms are coming in attempting to breastfeed? It's unconscionable. And yet we aren't trained in medical school or residency to be really good breastfeeding supporters. That makes no sense, but yet you will diagnose the hell out of a tumor that you'll never see. Make it make sense. The answer is it makes no sense. We are still having medical education as if it's like Margus Welby and it's 1950 and we haven't looked at the data, right? Breastfeeding is going to be an incredibly common issue that you will come across that is physiologically normal and beneficial, and yet we aren't trained to support it. We also aren't trained to deal with sleep. Every one of your patients deals with sleep. It's also one of the reasons I went back and got sleep training. So yeah, I will get off my soapbox now. I'm sorry, I do get passionate about this. So this is the other issue that I would ask you to be very aware of, because I found a tweet that I put back in 2018 saying, I was trained as a healthcare professional to deal with malignancies and bacteria and viruses. And I said, little did I know that the biggest threat would come from this type of stuff, as well as politics and insurances, as well as the conspiracy stuff, right? This is a real issue. And for you lactation supporting professionals, this is a problem for you too. Now, as I told you early on, a lot of my work has gravitated over to working to address these types of pseudoscience and conspiracies and fake news in the vaccination world, but it exists in the breastfeeding world, and we'll talk about that. So recognize the people that push these types of conspiracies or inaccuracies, who purposely push it, do so because they get profit from it. Hey, don't don't vaccinate, but use my crystals or my oils. Or they might say, oh, hey, your kid can't breastfeed effectively because they have this tissue down there, but let me burn it with my laser. We'll get to that further. And with vaccines, we'll see, hey, we'll get government out of your household and out of your school district, vote for us. Or they just want to control a narrative. There is always a reason to pushing disinformation. It's not just done willy-nilly. So we should be able to talk about the narrative as to why they push that. So the amazing thing that I have been using as my call to action in the last couple decades now, and last decade for sure, is this: the most powerful communication tool known, right? This is where we can reach people in mass and impact them with really important evidence-based information. And this is older data already. It's already a couple years outdated, but it looked at Americans with social media profiles. This is the blue hat analogy again. The vast majority have social media. And this is really pre-pandemic, the data that they got out of here before we were full into it, 2021, 2022, 2023. And if you look at people of childbearing age, I would say that you're probably in the high 90% of people that have social media profiles who get their news and their information from here. Are we lactation consultants and lactation advocates here in a powerful, robust way with a relevant messaging? Have we been trained to use this? Are we supported by our institutions? The answer typically is no. And this is the exact same message I give when I talk about vaccinations. And those numbers are increasing. So as you can see, the projections for the population, which is really getting into the 90% of people with social media users. And then one of the reasons I went so heavily into TikTok was I wanted to reach families of young kids. So that's why I put so many resources there. I'm now have gone off of Twitter completely, though my account still exists there. I'm onto Threads now because it's become kind of a toxic platform. But yeah, do I think you have to be on every platform? No, I think you should be on the platforms that are relevant to the audience you're trying to reach, while also recognizing we all have limitations and you may not have the ability to go on multiple platforms, but go onto the platforms where your audience is. When I talk about reaching people with breastfeeding or vaccination, I say this is what an hour of face-to-face time looks each year. We don't necessarily always get that in breastfeeding. We're a little more effective at getting more face-to-face time, but these kind of companies know what it's like to impact people and get behavior change, and they do so with communication. So they recognize that by putting collectively billions of dollars into social media campaigns, they can get you to buy your double pump mocha latte for $12, or to go on a cruise with them, or buy their products or their cars. They realize a positive ROI, return on investment. In spite of putting billions of dollars into communication, they get more than $1 back for every dollar spent. That means it's profitable. They do that because it's profitable and it changes behavior. We should be more effective with this tool as well. One last thing I do want to point out is in this realm is that Kids Plus, as you heard me make reference to, has a regional breastfeeding resources, the Breastfeeding Center of Pittsburgh. And while this was kind of anecdotal data, doing it about 1,000 regional referral visits per year, we were finding that only about 5 to 6% of kids had tongue ties that were considered relevant enough that they potentially could be interfering with breastfeeding. We actually do cut, which is the only recommended way to really address tongue tie, not laser. There's not data to suggest that laser is better. There's tons of data to suggest why lasers are worse. But we realized only 5 to 6% of our kids even met the criteria where the tongue tie was felt to be restrictive, and that there was knowledgeable breastfeeding support there to look and make the assessment, and within the scope of practice, which is beyond the lactation consultation consultant's scope of practice to make that diagnosis. But we, in our team format, where we had healthcare providers, pediatricians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants who were lactation consultants, but also working with lactation consultants to make that diagnosis, to either then move on to make the care here, where we would cut them. I cut close to 100, or refer to ENT, who would also cut. The reason I bring this up is that we are in the midst, in the breastfeeding world, of an absolute wave of disinformation about why breastfeeding challenges must be related to some tied or tethered tissue. The data does not support what is currently going on in the United States. We have a podcast on this. If you want to check out the Kids Plus podcast, which we did with Dr. Anna Meyer, who's an ENT from San Francisco and a huge breastfeeding advocate, where we started seeing in the mid, like 2005 to 2010, or it was around 2010, and then really ramping up from there, the terms of tongue tie, and then before you know it, there was lip ties and cheek ties. And in fact, there is very little data that was available to show normative data. How many people have these types of ties? And the data that I showed you at about 5% of kids requiring some further evaluation and maybe needing a cut for the tethered under the tongue tissue keeps coming in around 5%. But we know in mommy blogs, and we know that lactation consultants have been recruited by dentists who have lasers, and sometimes ENTs who have lasers, who say, oh, if you have any problems, send them to me. Those centers typically do not have breastfeeding expertise working with them. And even if they do, it doesn't necessarily meet the standard of care of really showing the right diagnostics and the right application of treatment. I put that information out here for you because we see again and again and again any breastfeeding difficulty being chalked up to, oh, that must be a tongue tie or a lip tie or a cheek tie. Oh, go get that taken care of. Oh, there's this dentist who's really good at it. And if you listen to the podcast that we did with Dr. Meyer, she even showed plenty of examples of calling these offices and say, oh, my kid, I think, has a tongue tie or lip tie. And they would say, no problem, $750, be here tomorrow at 9:30. Hadn't even looked at the kid. We also know when lasers are used, a burn, and those lasers are at thousands of degrees, a burn of that tissue is horrifically painful. We've all had a burn on our mouth, or most of us have. We know how painful that can be. And we know the multiple problems that come, because then kids can go on to have sensory issues and feeding aversions. If the tissue has to be removed under the tongue, a simple cut is the way to go. If there's excessive bleeding, yes. Sometimes they may use cautery, and only if there's excessive bleeding. And the ones we would handle would be ones where we could see no vessels. And almost in the 100 that I did, I never had to use cautery. So I just wanted to bring up, I know I'm really harping on this, but I want you to recognize there is a very well-structured campaign, particularly from the industry that is using lasers and recruiting people to purchase or lease those lasers, and then to go find people that engage with people that work with breastfeeding to say, refer them to me, refer them to me. They should just be cutting the tissue. It should not be what we're seeing right now. So again, the use of disinformation can lead to all sorts of things, including disinformation about tongue ties. It's usually using fear and distrust, sometimes hate and disinformation. I'll reference very quickly an article that this was from I think the Breastfeeding Medicine Journal, Breastfeeding So Easy a Doctor Can Support It. And there's also a video that I put out called Milk Money. I can send you links on those if you guys want them, but they kind of review a lot of the content that I was discussing here. Recognize that we take care of 2 patients, which is very important. And I always like to say to pediatricians out there, there's this condition called Nursemaids Elbow, which makes you feel like a rock star, because if a kid comes in with it, you recognize you just have to do a little maneuver and the kid can use their arm again, and the parents think you're the best thing since sliced bread. But when I learned how to help correct a latch and help a mother effectively breastfeed her baby, it was like Nursemaids Elbow, but multiple times a week versus once every year or two. So it's a team effort, recognizing everyone can help, but anyone can hurt. So in a pediatric office, make sure your culture is supportive of breastfeeding. Even if people have doubts or, oh, that wasn't for me, that's fine, but don't disrupt other people's goals or their education of the facts. And recognize that we need both personal and professional progress in this area. And our job, I think, is to empower moms and families to know the difference between good and bad feeds when they're breastfeeding. That should be established day one in the hospital when they deliver or at the birthing center, and where to get help. And ultimately, the key for breastfeeding in my mind is being the right people, which is we, people that are healthcare professionals that support breastfeeding, being the right people in the right place at the right time. That's critical. So, yeah, I will end it by just saying, be encouraging, be a good listener, be authentic, and be respectful. You know, that I think the other side that likes to beat up on breastfeeding says, oh, those breastfeeding Nazis or bullies or whatever. Yeah, we shouldn't be overzealous. We should be evidence-based and be respectful, but make sure moms get the right information when they need it, and be compassionate as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolynn. Dr. Webb is going to kind of start the dialogue here with our questions. And so for those of you who do have a question, please put it in the chat room, and we'll go ahead and field those questions and get them to Dr. Wolynn. And so Dr. Webb, you have been in private practice for how many years now?
About 30.
30. And you have right now somewhat of a rural practice, correct?
Yes, I am a rural practice. So we don't have access to 15 lactation consultants, and sometimes that support. We have a wonderful breastfeeding center, and that is helpful. And we do have lactation consultants in our area, but I think there's a big variety sometimes of experience with those lactation consultants and even the physicians. So how do we work on that?
Yeah, well, and to your point, right, IBCLCs are really, I would say, considered in training to potentially be at a top level, but lactation counselors and just breastfeeding advocates who are trained in breastfeeding that didn't get certification are all really important players in breastfeeding support. So I certainly don't want to portray that IBCLCs are the only people that can provide breastfeeding support. I think there's a range of people, and I don't even think you have to have a certification after your name, though that helps, right? Particularly as you're trying to get credentials that show that you've done the course. And lactation counselors are a 40-hour training course, which several health institutions and coalitions and various groups may even support in getting that education. But to your point, right, especially rurally, you may not have an abundance of people to lean on, which is why I am so thankful that you've developed that area of expertise in your own office, because that's a huge deal. I did a bunch of speaking in Kansas over a few-year period when they were doing a statewide initiative. And the sad thing that happened in the questions that came to me, Dr. Webb, was they would say, we only have one doctor for a 50-mile around area, and he is anti-breastfeeding, and he only pushes formula. And at that point, they said, so what do we do? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I don't want to be morbid. How old is he? Do we have to root for like the next healthcare wave to come through after this guy? But that was a terrible situation. Like, they had no other resources. It was like super rural, a lot of farming, one healthcare professional who was anti, and I don't, I guess the only thing you could say is thank goodness there's more digital resources, but even web access and high-speed internet can be a problem in rural areas. So it is an issue. We are way better off than we were years ago.
Yes.
But recognize, and you guys know this, right? Even doctors, even OB-GYNs, even health administrators can become very anti-breastfeeding if their own personal experience was a bad one, right? It's a traumatizing event. Me, as a pediatrician and as a lactation consultant, tried to be the lactation consultant for my wife. That did not go well, right? My wife was crying, the baby was crying, I was crying, right? I had to bring them to my teacher and like, can you please deal with this? I think I'm too close. But at least the fact that there are coalitions like yours and groups where you try and weave together communities around breastfeeding, we are so much more connected now than we used to be. So in that respect, I would say lean on digital resources, of course, if you can, but also see if you can help inspire people in your area to help if they are positive about breastfeeding or want to learn more to become positive. We have so many more routes to get to a place of improved competency. And so I would say in a rural area, try and build a network like you have with the coalition and the collective impact that we try and do now. Try and tap into some of those and see if you can get some trainings that might, be able to just take people up a notch, not even up to a credentials or credentials if they want to get there. But kudos to you for doing that for your practice. I think that's awesome.
Well, thank you. So there's a question in the chat about the Pediatric Dental Association recommending nursing only until 14 months when the AAP has now recommended breastfeeding up to 2 years. So yeah, I think that's a new recommendation for the AAP. So the Dental Association may not have updated theirs.
Yeah, that's it. I didn't know about that recommendation either. I mean, I did know about AAPs.
Yes.
Didn't know about the Dental Association saying 14 months. I mean, yeah, right. What we used to say, and up until the AAP came up with that increase from 1 to 2 years, was pretty much, try and get to a year if you can, if that's where your goals are, and beyond that's personal decision. And now they're saying that there's data to suggest the benefits up to 2 if you want to get to 2, and then beyond that personal decision. The one data point that I know everybody always asks about, and I don't think the data, I haven't done a recent literature search, so I don't know the answer, is what's the biggest bang for your buck? Like, if you could, like, people really trying to plan it out, it's going to take sometimes resources or professional sacrifice in some ways, right? If you're breastfeeding, sometimes people are weighing that out and saying, but if I could get the biggest bang for my buck, like, is it most important to get through the first 2 months or 4 months or 6 months or first 3 weeks or whatever? And there's not data around that that I'm aware of, which is, more is better than less. And we're here to try and meet your goals. And I will tell you, that's the mantra at our practice in our breastfeeding center, is we're here to help you meet your goals. We're not here to tell you what your goals are. And we're also here to support you the way you want to be supported, which I think takes the overzealousness out of it, right? That thing that people like to brand, because if they've had a bad experience, and it may be because somebody was overzealous, but it also may be that they just weren't able to meet their goals, and then they just viewed the additional support as negative because it just wasn't going well, because there's so much emotion, right? And there's so much trauma that can be associated with that. So in our support, I would describe it as evidence-based and empathetic, and saying, what are your goals? And we're going to do our best to help you meet your goals and support you the way you want to be supported. So if you ever feel we're coming on too heavy or anything, please let us know. Please let us know.
I think those are very good points. I think sometimes we don't pay attention to families' goals and are trying to push our goals. And I think that's often where mothers may start to feel, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression regarding their goals.
And think about, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, and think about like the collaborative approach we use to birth now, where you create a birth plan, or at least in its best forms, we now try and create birth plans. I think it's completely reasonable to create a feeding plan, particularly when it's around breastfeeding, and say, what are your goals? Let's do this in a shared way. Let's, it's like shared decision-making that we talk about in healthcare now. Let us help you, what are your goals? If you need more information about it, let's help you get that information. And then let's be, obviously, realistic and optimistic in trying to meet your goals, recognizing that we may not always meet everybody's goals. We've had people, particularly before surgeries were improved, with breast reductions or augmentations, where we knew, like, oh my goodness, that was an older approach and the chance of this working is going to be diminished, though I never squash anybody's hope. Right. So what we say is, oh, thank you for that information. Okay, there's a possibility this may have disrupted the ductal network, but we don't really know. And there's cases that every one of you has seen, like, this is never going to work, and it works. So you can never say never. So I think it's just good to be realistic and say, that's really good information. This may be an obstacle or not. Let's work and see where we get to.
Yes. Let's see, postpartum plan. Yes, be part of the postpartum plan. I think Heidi mentioned that not only a feeding problem, just a postpartum plan. I think a lot of moms they don't realize how tired they're going to be. They don't realize their body is going to be out of, just is different, or just to feel that sadness. So I think just having that whole idea about postpartum is not going to be the rosy going home, butterflies, baby sleeps through the night kind of thing too. So I think having just a whole realistic idea sometimes is very helpful.
And Becky, I see your point. I am no longer on the section of breastfeeding's council. I used to be a liaison from the section on administration and practice management to the section on breastfeeding. So I used to sit at their council meetings, but or their section meetings. But I think you're right. That could be a great project.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that. I think we have a meeting coming up, so we can talk about that too.
Good, good.
Let's get everybody on this same. Okay, there's a question about, can you share the data on the oral tethers, the laser versus the cut? What's your diagnostic criteria to determine if it's truly restricting?
Yeah, I'll have to see. So Dr. Madalena has the updated information on that. I'll have to see if I can share it through her. But I can tell you that I gave a talk. It was down in Texas with like I forget what it was called, like the Academy or the Association of Pediatric Otolaryngologists, right? So it was the pediatric ENTs. And I spoke on a tongue tie. So there is no data. I just want to be clear. There's not a single study that shows that laser is superior to cutting. Now, cautery, electric cautery may be necessary if there's bleeding, but most of these can be bloodless procedure. So there's no benefit, but lasers are, fancy and sexy and super expensive and are pushed for a reason. And oftentimes there's a lot of money behind that. As far as the studies, I know that the ENTs were working on creating normative data to show, and their data was coming around 5% of tongue ties were felt to be potentially related to breastfeeding difficulty and requiring some type of revision. 5%. Think about the number of kids that get referred in or that through mommy blogs, oh, anything that's problematic, that's got to be a tongue tie. You guys all know, right, that the data has shown repeatedly year upon year that the vast reason for breastfeeding difficulty is suboptimal latch. 90% of the time. So you need to be skilled, and I mean really skilled. I remember after going through 3 years of residency and being trained and certified as an IBCLC, how scared I was for that first mom when I actually was in the room alone trying to do that. So there's something that comes like with anything else. You get your 10,000 hours under your belt and you feel way more comfortable in trying this, try a different position. So I'll see if I can get a link for you regarding some updated information to answer that question. I do want to point out there is no significant data that talks about lip ties being the cause for breastfeeding failure. Now, do you have to have the lip averted? We know that's not the case, though we all try, and at least when I used to have a lot more sessions where I was working hands-on to try to avert the lip, but the lip doesn't have to be averted to have an effective latch and a suck and a swallow. But there's a lot of people say, oh, look how thick that frenulum is, or, oh, that's even going to mess with the teeth. The data coming from dentistry and ENT is actually not, that they don't cut those. And I would tell you that is considered standard of care, that you do not mess with frenulum. And by the way, the percentage of people in the population that have some frenulum from their upper lip to their gum, 85%. Guess what that means? It's normal. It's normal to have that tissue there. And then when you get into people talking about buccal ties and cheek ties, this is stuff that, if you think about it, if I can make profit by pushing my laser to cut lots of different tissues, I'll point out anything I can. Show the data. Where's the study that validates that ties in the cheeks or lips, which does not exist, is problematic, or under the tongue that requires a laser? It does not exist. So when you have dentists or ENTs saying, oh, send them to me and we'll laser that, no problem, there is a lot of data of harm and sensory issues and burns and infections that happen to kids that does not need to be done. A snip with scissors is really considered the gold standard.
Thank you. That's that is back to the old days when I first started. It was all yeast.
Everything was yeast, right?
Everything was yeast, and we
was using gentian violet and all that stuff back then.
We spent a long time on yeast as a source of pain.
Yep.
So there was another question about posterior versus anterior, and I think that's kind of the thing too.
There are questions about that, and I'm not up to date enough on the data. I know that's a little bit of a debate that goes around back and forth. I would tell you there's large group in the ENT world that is suspicious of posterior ties. So I don't want to give misinformation. I am not up to date on the literature as I used to be, but I'll see if Dr. Madalena has a reference that I can get on that.
Well, and Becky just mentioned that the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine does have a statement that we released in 2021. So there is that. And, we've had quite a lot of education too. But I think the point is that often this will cause pain for the baby. And so sometimes there may be the baby may not eat or may have ongoing problems because of that. I think the other thing that sometimes we all have to be a little bit careful about is placebo effect. And I think I see that a lot where, mothers are desperate or fathers are desperate, and then something is done and suddenly they do feel like it's better. And I think there may be some placebo effect for that. So I think
which is absolutely right. Why we need more data and more studies to really flush that out, and if we can have controls to tease out what could be placebo effect. But to your point, that it's real, the desperation, the fear, the anger, the exhaustion, those are all real things, which is why it's so important to create a culture of really, compassionate support that's evidence-based. And I happen to be blessed to fall into a residency where they did this training, where then we hired most of the providers that came out of that program. And we were just sitting on all this understanding and expertise in breastfeeding. But I hope societally we are in a better place to recognize that. The problem is when it becomes popular, and now you have 4 out of 5 women breastfeeding, right? Think about it. In 1971, if only 1 out of 5 women is even breastfeeding and it fails, there's not a market to nail. When you have 4 out of 5 babies breastfeeding and a birth cohort of close to 4 million a year, hey, that's a lot of tongues that can be zapped. And I hate to say it, but there's nefarious actors out there that want to make money off of parental angst. It's a real market. They do it not just with breastfeeding, they do it with lots of other products to address parental angst. And I hate to say it, there's real shysters and snake oil salespeople out there.
Well, I mean, look at the number of baby products that are out there and special bottles, and there's just lots and lots. So
how did our kids survive without infrared, pulse oximetry, video link feeds, right? Think about it. Our parents would be sitting there like, we didn't have a monitor. If you cry loud enough, we came in, right? Now the kids are like zoned in. I can tell you their pulse oximetry. I can tell you what their first and second heartbeat look like. I mean, it's all about playing to parental angst, and it's sad. I mean, and particularly in the age of social media, you have parents that shame other ones. Oh, you don't have this product, you don't have that product. It's like, it's just overwhelming to these newer parents now.
It is, and I do think that's how we get to a lot of different, different or why that has become so popular. There was also a question, I think we could probably, there's a lot that we can talk about.
I'm sorry for going over here.
So Heidi, I don't know if you want, there's one more question just about sucking blisters, but I think that's another, common thing that I see, and babies have been sucking on their tongues or their lips for a long time. It's going to take them a little bit longer to get through that, but usually that shouldn't interfere. I wouldn't think a long time. So
right, I agree.
It's normal. It's like peeling skin and all those other things are normal babies. I think we still need to probably continue to work with our ENT and our OB cohorts, because as you said, this starts early. If they've never made a feeding plan until they get to us, then it's a little hard to change things. So we're still working to try to bridge those gaps and get our OB colleagues and our educators on board as well.
Well, congratulations to all the things you guys are doing in Oklahoma. I think it's just wonderful, and I'm honored for the opportunity to speak with you guys. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all, and I wish you guys the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. And any other questions that people maybe didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to maybe email those to Heidi, and we can try to get those addressed, and we'll get the links to all the great stuff that Dr. Wolynn talked about And then just a reminder, you can see in the chat box, COBA is hosting its first ever in-person kind of full day training and workshop with Maya Bowman, and that will be on September 20th, General Manual Therapeutic Techniques in Lactation. So take a look at that, and hope to have a lot of you join us at that. Heidi, any other final words?
Just a big shout out to Dr. Wolynn. I also want to say thank you to Riley Wolynn, who is, I think she's an MPH student at University of Pittsburgh. Go Panthers, Panthers.
Yep.
My dad went to UPitt. And so thank you so much. You and your staff have been delightful to work with. And I have a feeling this will not be the end of our relationship with you, because you are fantastic. And thank you for all that you do to help moms and families and babies and professionals. So Dr. Wolynn, you are delightful. Thank you for helping us practice evidence-based medicine.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Have a great day, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.